How long is too long before a meta swaps? And what are the factors that can cause a meta to outstay its welcome? That's what I want to talk about today, and this has largely been inspired by the reaction to my recent video about Juno, where I was saying, basically, Juno has been really, really good, an absolute must pick, literally like 100% of the time, complete meta definer, so she needs changes. But I think a lot of people kind of took that as like, I don't exactly like Juno, or they think that Juno should be around. We've had so many characters who have been super meta for so long. Why is it not okay that it's her turn now, right? It's her turn to be the meta, and people are generally favorable about that. So I think that, you know, that is a fair sentiment, but this is a much more complicated question than it leads on to be, in my opinion. So I want to start kind of adding a little bit of context before we dive in to all of this, and I want to talk about goats, which you are watching goats on your screen. You're seeing a variation of goats with Winston, since this is new Bonnie, but that's, you know, basically the same thing, right? He just kind of replaces the Reinhardt for the verticality, but the comp generally plays exactly the same, with a little more divey potential, I guess. But let's talk about goats, right? What is the thing that we can all agree about goats, no matter what you think, right? It lasted too long. Nothing about the quality of the games, nothing about the quality of the comp. When a comp is the sole thing that you can run for a year plus, and all other strategies are so exceedingly harder in comparison, there's a bit of a problem there, right? You can like goats. I think that's totally fine. I think a lot of modern Overwatch was kind of enhanced because of goats. A lot of people really learned the ins and outs of, you know, not just the like kind of less of the shooter aspects, but more of the team play MOBA ability usage stuff, because you had to min-max so hard to win in a goats mirror, right? That's why people really love this meta. So nothing wrong with goats in and of itself, but like I said, I think the one thing about goats was that it was just too simple to make work, that simple fixes or buffs to other characters that weren't in goats that could potentially deal with it just aren't going to work, because everyone is just getting so much comfortable, or more comfortable with goats. It's much more easier to execute than some of those other comps, which you just kind of had no experience playing with at the time. So you can't really justify using those strategies, and that is part of why goats lasted so long. Now, I think the problem with it lasting so long is that the variety was kind of few and far between. I mean, you are seeing a different variant of goats technically right now, but how much does that variety really matter when it just swaps out one person on the team comp that doesn't really cause it to fundamentally change how it plays, right? I think you see a lot of this. You'll see Sombra and Mei come out from time to time in goats. You'll see Ana come out from time to time in goats, as like countermeasures to certain maps or certain other strategies that they might be thinking. You'll already see the Reinhardt is back for Fate, because they've been having a lot of trouble pushing up into this high ground position, so they want to brawl it better, right? The thing about goats, though, is that it's something that wasn't played very often in ranked, right? Unless you're at the higher levels, right? But a lot of people just didn't like goats. They didn't like the entire hero pool of the characters in goats. And if you just wanted to play DPS, you know, that's not part of goats and will never be part of goats, in those very few scenarios, by the way. On ladder, you know, let alone you get 2 DPS, right? So something that's really strange about goats, why it was really being called for removal, is not so much about the live game. It is not about the overall experience of every single player, although to an extent, when goats is that powerful and you aren't playing it and the other team might be playing a better version, then it does feel really frustrating. But it's something that we watched for a year plus without any fail, any delay, very, very minor variation that doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, right? That's where the problem is. It feels like goats was around and super in your face for that amount of time, right? It was just insanely there, just it completely overbearing every other strategy. because of what we watched in Owl, right? It exacerbates the problem, but watching is the only thing you watch is an Owl. And I think I wanted to bring that up because GOATs had the misfortune of just being so dominant that a lot of people are not going to like GOATs because that's all they're going to be watching. And as a spectator, I think that's really important for esports and games of this variety. The spectator is a very important part. The spectating experience is a very important part, right? You think about, some ultimate, like Smash Ultimate majors, and you're just watching Steve and Sonic and these really boring characters that a lot of people don't really like. So the spectator experience isn't that high, and you also kind of don't feel the need or want to play the game as much because when you go engage with it outside of the game, it doesn't give you that magic that you would want, right? Especially for lower ranked people who are not going to be playing into GOATs. They just see nothing to grasp onto, right? It's just a complete different world, but the different world is like one thing, right? So yes, metas can completely overstay their welcome, even if they are good metas, right? Like, I'm not the biggest GOATs fan in the world, but it's not like a terrible meta, and in fact has a lot of merit, like I talked about. It's a lot of little nuances that made this meta so special to a lot of people. But the variables that caused it to just be so overbearing and no longer wanting to play it is so less. That was actually an insane play by EQO, by the way. That was so cool. Anyways, now I want you to kind of relay this back to any Overwatch 2 meta. And we're gonna just take a look at some random stuff. This is going to be like the Mauga, Pharah being very good, right? Venture, I think, pops up here. This is the Dallas major, right? When we think about a lot of Overwatch 2 metas that we don't like, I think much more often, especially compared to Overwatch 1 metas, it's all about characters that we don't like. It's honestly a lot less so about the strategies and more about specific characters that are unfun, Mauga, Hog, Orisa, or even the characters that aren't even unfun. They're just there forever and they're super meta defining. Something like a Juno, something like a Kiri, something like a Sojourn, a Lucio even, whoever it may be. You are going to be playing into these all the time. That's like the big difference between Overwatch 1 and Overwatch 2, since it's much more individual, and you can play these characters, I think, much more effectively outside of team compositions, right? It's a lot of characters that get broken rather than strategies that get broken, if that makes a lot of sense. Then you are going to feel that in your games much heavily, right? Or much more heavily, rather. Is that grammatically collect? Oh my god, I can't speak. Anyways, that is going to be felt by you a lot more. So I think it wears down on you much more than just only ever watching it. And since Overwatch League or Overwatch Champion Series is not on as often, it's not in the public perception as much anymore, at least to more casual viewers even, then all they're seeing is just playing the game with Orisa in every game, with Juno in every game, with Brig in every game, for example, in these ranks. And that tends to make metas become more stale more quickly. Why is my video buffering? Anyways, I think that's kind of like a part of it, right? Again, even with characters that are generally pretty well liked across the board, they're just still going to get caught in the crossfires. I think like Lucio gets caught in the crossfires because he was meta for so long, because of his, just a lot of different factors. But now that we have a different character that gives the speed, you can play greedier, brawly comps like that. A lot of people are not calling for Juno to be hard nerfed because they're just so sick and tired of Lucio, even though he's Lucio. I mean, like, we all love Lucio, don't we? So it's such a weird thing here where metas can overstay their welcome much more quickly in Overwatch 2, but they also go away much more quickly because of balance and everything. So I do not think that time in per se is the major factor here, right? That's kind of like my larger point going into all of this, right? Time itself, there is no one amount of time that's like, this meta is here for too long, so we need to remove this character is too strong for this amount of time, so we need to fix it, right? It really isn't so simple. Do people like playing it? Do people like watching it? When does it feel like it's getting stale in that regard? the meta is not getting pushed, it's not as interesting anymore, it's not as fun to play. That's a much bigger, harder problem to answer. So I guess basically I don't want to suggest that it's kind of like some faux algorithm where well-liked characters, it basically you map like which well-liked characters they are mapped to the frequency in your game. So if they're much more well-liked, then the same amount of frequency as something like a Mauga, you're gonna be able to be okay with it for a much longer amount of time than with one of those frustrating characters. But I don't know, like the variety just needs to be there in some kind of meaningful way, right? Even when we are in good and fun metas, it will get boring, and there are going to be people who don't like it overall, which is kind of like not really the point of this, but they will get stale. They will get boring, right? It's just going to happen a lot of time, right? Like most of the time, it is going to get pretty stale, especially if the metas are exceedingly simple. Think of like just regular Ori rush kind of stuff, right? Or Mauga, honestly. I know a lot of pros actually kind of like the Mauga meta because of the kind of chicken game that you're playing with the other Mauga about when you stomp and all of that. But for the most part, I don't think that is kind of the case, right? There's 41 characters in this game, and seeing only 5 or 7 of them just isn't engaging after a bit of time, right? It's just not what we want to aim for. But I want to put a little wrench in that theory, okay? Right? I've been talking all this time about like variety is great, all of that. But the problem with only focusing on this variety and everything is that it kind of leaves out the idea that the metas can naturally shift and get to healthier places that we might like, right? Older balance theory for many games, fighting games are a really good example, is that you let a version of the game roll out for a very long time, a year, years, if that, right? There's no balance patches. That's like, just how old games work. There are no balance patches. It doesn't really matter or work that way. So you learn and you adapt, and things are going to get stronger over time. People are going to develop more things, and if the game really has legs and a lot of player base, this will happen faster and faster and faster. I think a really good example is when they added Guilty Gear XX Accent Core Plus R to rollback, online play of a game that's about 2 decades old. It has a pretty definitive tier list of characters that are really good or not so good. And one of those characters that's like bottom 3 back when the game launched with its netcode was Abba. Abba was not seen as a particularly strong character. She was extremely weak without her install, and it was just too hard to get there. And you could even, she was top 1 in her install, but if you can't get to it, then it doesn't matter. But as time went on, people started playing the game, developing the character. She's kind of moved her way up into a mid-tier position. You might have been hearing this if you watch any Smash Melee. Donkey Kong is like a character that is real and at risk of winning a major, right? A super major, like really big stuff. And this is Melee, the game that has been so figured out and so competitive. It's Fox only, all of that jazz. Seems like nothing can break it, and yet so many mid-tier characters are popping up because the meta has been developing for 20 years, right? The level of play has just climbed and climbed, and there are more things being found, more theory, more application for those things. And so to circle that back to Overwatch, right? I actually want to bring back up Goats. I think Goats is actually a really interesting example because the level of play for Goats kept going higher and higher and higher. And I firmly believe that the reason people see Goats, a lot of people see Goats at such a good meta, is because of the length, is because it was around for so long that they were able to develop it and find those little nuances and change how it really worked. And that's why so many, it was so hard to win against a better team than you, because they had all the little micro down to a science. And if you were not up to their level, you were just going to lose. And of course, that's in competitive integrity's wet dream kind of idea, but that is just kind of the truth, right? What do I got here? Yeah, so time can actually be favorable to a meta perception. But again, we're going to talk about another instance where time isn't as favorable to a really good meta, right? So I think the thing about like a couple of these metas, I always talk about variety and everything, but if a meta is allowed to go on longer and longer, sometimes, actually a lot of times, meta variety will go down over time, right? So there's plenty of instances where the variety goes up or the level of play goes up more and more and more. There's also instances where you lose a lot of things along the way. I think 2021 season is a really good example. Now, I do understand that there were hero pools in some of these stages, so sometimes the variety was coming from the fact that you couldn't play all the characters at all times. Right now you're seeing Orisa Diva, which was really just if you didn't have Sigma to pick, then you pick Diva, because it's the slower off tank who can help the Orisa. But I think that late game Overwatch actually had a really good meta. Not necessarily like the very, very end where Owl was on the beta patch of Overwatch 2, so you weren't really seeing the highest level play on the Overwatch 1 patch. And it just kind of devolved into the individualistic characters like Sigmas and Hogs and Balls running around kind of doing their own thing, snipers everywhere, Tracer. So we're gonna leave that out, like the later 2022, but like 2021 Owl, I think it was the most like varied I'd seen a lot of team comps, even in the things that didn't have hero bans. You could play Rhyme Brawl, you could play Winston Dive, you could play Double Shield, Double Bubble, you could play Ball, Zen, and many other iterations of those comps. Because there's such different variety of which types of comps you can play, it also brings a lot of variety in the characters that you can play to counter those things. I mean, I remember seeing like Torbjorns coming up all these places, and even characters I perceived really weak in Overwatch 1 at that time, like Genjis and stuff. Like, they do find their way into the fray every once in a while because of that kind of variety. And so it creates those special moments where it's not even a troll pick to pick these characters that aren't necessarily so good at all times. And even though there weren't meaningful updates for a long time in those later years, the meta is still really interesting to watch and develop over time until it wasn't. Because I think it became abundantly clear that as you went on and as the level of play got higher, Ball, Diva, Tracer, or not Tracer, yeah, Tracer obviously, Tracer, Brig, Zen comps with, you know, probably like an Echo or something, were just the best. They were very versatile for what they were. They had a very survivable backline, a really good dive pressure. They did well into poke comps. They did well into brawl comps. Dive was a bit of a weaker point, but a good Zen Brig backlines could survive it with the right conditions. So it became more and more clear that this comp was going to stay around for a while. And I actually think that the Overwatch 2 kind of launching early with that meta, right? Like Overwatch League rather, being on Overwatch 2, launching, so you didn't have to see all this all the time, because I do think that like these kind of comps would have been king come that amount of time, and I think we would have been sick of them. But how many balance patches would we have probably gotten? Probably not that much, because they were really focused on Overwatch 2 at the time, right? Now, I think the comp is fun personally, that kind of stuff, but for the most people, I mean, this is a list of characters that a lot of people just don't play or don't like playing. Wrecking Ball is hard. Zenyatta was a glass cannon, is a glass cannon, so he's pretty hard. Brig is not a character that I think a lot of people want to play all the time, although I think she's really fun and engaging. Oh, excuse me. It's that kind of stuff, right? Where that's another like instance where time was maybe not as kind to this meta. So you can't just let it be out forever. Like, it has positives and negatives that are kind of hard to even understand, right? It's hard to even foresee what will happen with our perception of these metas, of these characters, of these strategies, with the amount of time that, is allotted, I guess. So I guess, what is my point, right? I've been sitting here saying like, oh my god, I'm talking about meta times, like, oh, well, this is a factor, but is it really a factor? Does it really matter when this happens? Blah, 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 blah. But I kind of want to put this to community feedback, to you guys, and to me, of course, as well. It's that when we suggest changes, when we talk about the game, I think it's pretty easy to be blinded about or by what has been meta in the past and what is currently meta and how long and the frequency and all of that, right? But just because something is good for a while doesn't mean that they also have to pay for their sins, right? Regardless of the character, right? What we want are healthy characters and a healthy variety that can come up because of a nice, just a pool of healthy characters, right? I don't want Ryan hard meta just as much as I don't want Orisa hard meta, right? I don't want any tank to have like a basically 100% win rate, or any character, I say win rate, pick rate, or any character for that matter, right? Changes should be constructive, and they should aim at making the game more engaging when you use those strategies that have been good in the past, right? So when you talk about stuff, we can always talk about like smaller balance changes, but like, what is the point? What are we getting at? What do we want to happen there? I don't want a character just to be dead for the sake of being dead. You want characters to still be able to be played, and if they're more frustrating, how do we get those characters in a spot where we want to play them, where we want to play against them? And I know it's not just bad Orisa. Orisa doesn't have Fortify anymore, Lamau, and that's the only change, you know? It's got to be interesting. It's got to make the game more fun overall for both parties. And I think that's when I propose changes like that, that is really what I'm getting at, right? When I made that Juno video, for instance, in fact, it wasn't even supposed to be like, hey, has a problem series, right? Although that was just like a flashy name, I don't think there really is a Juno problem per se. But when a character is a 100% pick rate for 2 months, we do have to look into like what is going on there, right? As much as I like Juno a lot, I love Lucio a lot, I like Kiri, I like Sojourn. I know those characters have been good in the past, but it kind of pains me to see some of those characters just be borderline unplayable, because it's just it kind of ruins a lot of the fantasy and the variety of this game. Oh, and I'm just realizing now in this series they actually are playing Sigma, so Sigma was not banned in that previous game. But I think that's it. I forgot really to make much of an outro, I guess, but you know, again, if you make suggestions, you make changes, I just want to just think more about the broader history, broader context of where these are coming from, and know that I think there is a world where every character is healthy and fun to play against regardless. But that is going to do it for me. Thank you guys. Please make sure you subscribe if you have not already, and comment what you think of this subject, right? Is there a fine line for when a meta is bad? Should characters be, or some characters, be meta in the first place? I'd love to hear back from you. Please leave a like while you're at it. This was streamed live, twitch.tv/Lane Hemingway, if you want to get on these discussions live. Also, I am giving away 3 months free to my Twitch subscription if you are able to win the Game of the Year prediction contest. Everything you need to know about that is in the description below, but get them in soon. I have a feeling that next week is when we're going to hear about these, and that is when the predictions close. So get your hat in the ring now. Okay, thank you guys so much for watching. Have a good day.